Good morning and greetings from CSW NGO. We wanted to welcome you to our session on expanding the online gender-based violence fight, addressing digital exploitation with male allies in tech in Global South context. As we know, the digital revolution continues to promise empowerment to women, girls, and marginalized populations in older diversity. However, gender inequality seems to be engineered into the very algorithms that run the internet, the weakness of the governance and accountability attached to it, and the toxic norms that are often promoted on it. Such inequality is deeply felt by women and girls, particularly in the Global South. During this panel, we will examine some of those realities women and girls face. We will concretely talk about the ways that online platforms become arenas for exploitations that exacerbate gender-based violence, whether it's cyber harassment, political violence, to the perilous connection between technology and human trafficking. We hope today to talk about those issues, ignite awareness, and advocate for interventions to eradicate digital exploitation and online gender-based violence, with particular attention for an urgent call to make male allies in tech to step forward and end tech-facilitated GBV in all its forms. In the words of the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, states must uphold the obligation of due diligence and the principle that human rights protected offline should also be protected online. In that spirit, I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Silly Moore, and I work with the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, which is an international nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that promotes democracy worldwide. One of the issues that we care and work on very closely is making sure that more women can enter and participate in politics and political processes in public life. And yet, over the recent years, we've noticed that with increasing rates of online violence against women, many women in politics are either leaving political life, and other women, particularly young women, are deterred from even entering it. The idea that politics is dirty, and so part of the cost is that you will be abused and harassed online, is something that we don't think should be the cost of any job, much less a job where women are seeking to promote the interests of their constituency. Moreover, it's often more women than men who tend to face that kind of vitriol online. We've done studies in different countries around the world, and it's always more women than male politicians who face those threats. And in particular, what we're calling violence against women or gender-based violence online, the gendered aspect of it has to do with either those insults or abuse or threats are geared at women because they're women, or they're gendered in nature with, let's say, innuendos about their sexual lives, about their appearance, about their parenting skills, very much related to them as women. And also we see that as intentional in a political strategy to exclude women from the political process. And without women in the political process, of course, no political process can be seen as inclusive or democratic. So with that in mind, I wanted to introduce to you a panel of 5 really interesting points of view on this issue in alphabetical order. Eduardo Correa is the co-executive director of TEDIC, which is the Association of Technology, Education, Development, Research, Communication, established in 2012 in Paraguay. It focuses on civic technology and human rights protection on the internet, including cultural rights and knowledge through Creative Commons licenses. And he's sitting over there to the far left. Welcome. Next to him is Kamasvat Chantavisuk Tam, who is currently a partnership and advocacy specialist with the Civil Society Division at UN Women. Kam has more than 14 years of experience working on gender equality and ending gender-based violence on national, regional, and global levels. He also worked as the coordinator of the Regional Learning Community for Transforming Mass Communities for Gender Justice in East and Southeast Asia. Next to him, I guess I'm going off of the alphabetical order, so we can be in order of people seated, is Kat Townsend, who is an expert advisor with the World Wide Web Foundation, the Web Foundation. She has devoted her career to government transparency, collaboration across global partners, and improving technical capacity in the social sector. She also worked on data-driven prioritization of delivery of the COVID-19 vaccine in low and middle income countries, strategic development of civic tech for social accountability, and data transparency and civic engagement. Formerly also worked with USAID and the State Department here in the United States under President Obama's Innovation and Transparency Initiative. And next to her is Daniel, Gallion, sorry. I just renamed you. David, right? You know, you love it? Okay, you can, yeah, I can tell you how to legally change your name. Daniel Gallion, of course, is the Senior Director and Chief of Staff at Payoneer, which is a global payment platform. He works to set the strategic vision for the company's risk and compliance. In that role, he helps guide the company's strategies at the crossroad of technology and finance. He also works on how tech companies can address pressing social issues such as gender-based violence, and of course, in particular, the use of digital transactions in contexts like human sex trafficking. He's also been working and is an expert on collaborating with industry partners to develop robust content moderation policies and integrating safety features into digital platforms. Welcome, Daniel. And last but not least is Ali Gagalang, who is the Executive Director and President of Breaking Silence Movement, which is a nonprofit organization committed to advocating for gender equality and empowering marginalized voices. She also brings over a decade of experience in the tech industry in Silicon Valley. That unique perspective informs her work in advancing social justice causes. She's also the co-founder of Hiraya Media, a digital media company that amplifies the unrepresented voices and promotes meaningful dialogue and narratives surrounding Filipino culture. Welcome all. So let's start with you, Ali. This organization, your organization, Breaking Silence Movement, which started in the Philippines and has grown into a global association on gender-based violence programming that really seeks to connect GBV survivors to services in progress. What could you share about the scope and breadth of online or tech-facilitated exploitation, harassment, and online GBV generally, especially against women and girls in the global south? And what have you seen are the impacts of that?
Thank you. Absolutely. What we've seen at Breaking Silence movement is that the issue is far simpler than we've previously discussed. It always boils down to poverty, right? With almost 23% of Filipinos living under the poverty line, that's 25.2 million people who thinks basic necessities are a luxury. And so that's just how it is right now in Manila. It's not something like the food and water, shelter, clothes. It's just something that they have to scrounge money for. You know, it's not something that they actually like. Money that they have, it has to be set aside to be able to afford these things. On the contrary, on the other hand, surfing, internet surfing is so easy to access in the Philippines. That's an hour of internet surfing at an internet cafe costs about 15 pesos to 35 pesos. That's $30 cents to 60 cents in the Philippines. So it's easily accessible. And so in the contrast, like I said, food is hard to come by. A kilo of rice is 40 pesos per kilo. That's $1 roughly, and 1 kilo of rice lasts only a day for a family of 5, and that's just rice alone, right? So they don't have access to. It's hard to buy vegetables, meat with just a small amount of salary. right? So that hunger that they feel, that desperation that they feel, in order to survive, right, they will do anything they will do anything necessary to just get money, extra money, to be able to afford this food, right? And in saying that, the primary victims of this abuse are marginalized community. And so, not just in the Philippines, but in the global South. So they're very vulnerable to tech facilitated gender-based violence. So because they go to the internet and see, the demand sometimes for just like explicit photos of women and girls that they can easily sell and get money off of, right? And so it turned, but this desperation, they go, like I said, means any means necessary, and even exploiting their own children to just get money and be able to afford this food, and that's the gravity of the situation. So while the issue is very straightforward, right, it's very multifaceted. It's a ecosystem of stakeholders, including household members, which is the primary victims of this online gender-based violence, and then of course the government who is responsible for making policies, laws and regulations, government initiatives, and also the private sectors who, in an ideal world, of course, they should be our allies, but sometimes they're not, because sometimes, like, we live in a capitalistic world, right? So sometimes what they do is that they put money over anything else, even social justice, right? So in an ideal world, they should be an ally, but which is this panel is a great this panel is assembled greatly just because it's about time that we talk about allyship in tech, male allyship in tech, and with people who work, people like us who work in women's rights and gender-based violence. And you've also asked about the impacts of, online gender-based violence in marginalized communities, and more often than not, it's not physical at all. Sometimes it's trauma, it's PTSD, perpetuating violence, stalling societal progress by normalizing harassment, perpetuating discrimination, and immortalizing stereotypes. This means that regression hampers collective advancement and perpetuates a cycle of poverty.
Thank you so much. And as you were talking, I was thinking of the research that India has done with women in political parties. And what they often say is that the majority of the abuse and harassment they face is actually from other men within their own political parties, right? Sometimes it really comes from within the house, literally. Cam, if you don't mind, I'll go next to you. As I mentioned, you dedicated more than 14 years of your career to ending gender-based violence at different levels, and now with you and women. You also coordinated a regional network of activists seeking to transform masculinities for gender justice in East and Southeast Asia, including in your home country of Laos. In your work with men and on masculinities, what have you seen in terms of harmful norms and the interplay between the online to offline gender-based violence and the impact that you've seen both on men and women?
Thank you. Risk factors for men use of violence, which is perpetrations, and risk factors for women's experience of violence, which is victimizations, are very similar between online and offline violence. So in our work, we have seen a lot the connection between the two setting of violence and two contexts. So the harmful masculine behaviors or attitudes that are prevalent in offline setting that can lead to violence in communities, in families, are very prevalent in the online setting too. And also, it's interesting because online setting can be such a anonymous space for expressions, and this behavior can even be exacerbated in the online setting. So we have seen non-violent boys and men in offline setting would become very violent in online setting because there is this anonymous space for expressions, which is a very tricky point because in our region and in many parts of the world, um, where democratic and civic space are shrinking for people to participate, and online have become a very free space for participation and expressions, which is what we needed in a very shrinking space setting. But at the same time, it also creates this um, unsafe space for many people to experience. So certain behavior that we have seen for men in offline settings, for example, controlling behavior during dating, for example, boyfriend checking girlfriend's mobile phone, using application to track where the girlfriends are. Um, that kind of controlling behavior can lead to intimate partner violence in offline setting, but that kind of behavior can also exacerbate offline setting by using technologies or devices to control her, for example. Um, and and we also have learned that it's harder to police or to monitor what's happening because online space is it's borderless. So now it allows men and boys to conduct some behavior beyond their own space, their physical space. For example, a person in Laos can bully another person in Thailand, or a person in the Philippines can go online and shame another person in Vietnam. So in that context, it's harder to work in addressing different form of practices across these borders because we don't have a clear divisions and ways of monitoring and controlling this online space. And interestingly, I just read an article that came up literally a couple of weeks ago on The Economist. I don't know if you have seen, called The Angry Men, Angry Young Men, where the Economist conducted a survey in European countries, South Korea and China and the UK, and they have found that younger men are more conservative than older men, and younger men now support the idea that feminism has gone too far. And younger men and men have found this online space, which is called manosphere, where they gather to express their anger, to express their bitterness of their life due to poverty, due to unemployment, or whatever they perceive as being taken away from them. So again, online space has become this space for men to reinforce each other, and it has become so global because we're talking, the conversation is about global South context, but the online space doesn't have that global north or global South context in a sense because there can be connection between men across the world to share similarities and share their anger, and they reinforce each other, and this has become quite a dangerous space for gender-based violence. So yeah, just to park it there. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you, Pam. I think the study also talked about how within young men and women, young men seem to be more conservative than the young women, right? So they're talking about there's the same age of generation, but the women are sort of growing more progressive and liberal, and the men seem to be growing more conservative and, like you said, kind of a backlash. Daniel, as a senior executive of a company at the crossroads of technology and finance, what do you advise tech companies can do to address gender-based violence? And I'll just add that I just noticed that, for example, Meta will be shutting down CrowdTable, which was sort of a scraping tool that a lot of researchers, including us, were using to really, identify harmful content and misinformation and gender harmful information. And the fact that this tool will not be available anymore, at least in the context of Facebook and Instagram, right, suggests a movement away from transparency. So it'd be wonderful to sort of hear from your perspective, what can tech companies do to address GBV? And then specifically in your company, which is a global payment platform, how do you address the use of digital transactions in GBV context, specifically or particularly in the context of sex trafficking?
Great questions. As a tech executive, I will preface this by saying a lot of the North Star metrics for product is specifically around utilization, is specifically around margin, total margin, revenue associated with the product. It doesn't actually contextualize the underpinnings of like how users are utilizing it and the thematics around the consequences of such a product. So I'll preface it by that. I will say that it's not enough for tech companies to just issue out community guidelines for their users. It's just simply not enough. We've seen across the board in the tech space a proliferation of trust and safety teams. Trust and safety teams are basically an augmented layer of operations that really try to content moderate. But as you can imagine, across many social media platforms, we're talking about millions of users. So how can we address and automatically review these millions of users on a daily basis to really combat GBV-based content? So it's $1 million question, right? I've seen solutions around scraping, right? I've seen solutions around tolerance around risk. So a lot of how content is rated is basically on core tenets, right? Like, are there keywords in the content that specifically, refer to GBV as an example? There's subtext within images that highlight, if you ever save a picture on your computer, you'll notice like there's subtext behind it. So that's another way we can look at it. I think it's not enough to just have a trust and safety team. I think what we're seeing in the tech industry now is, as I don't want to call this a buzzword because I really think this is really going to be impactful, is the usage of AI, specifically generative AI. If you think about a company trying to content moderate millions of users, right? It's not enough to just hire outsourced workers to review this content, right? It's not enough to just really I'm talking like you got to spend like 2 seconds per message per image, right? What we're seeing from AI is like obviously from a guidelines risk scoring perspective, right? So adding that layer to your community guidelines. You're able to have more targeted interventions, right, from a trust and safety perspective. What I mean by that is, creating algorithms, right, associated with your AI to really pick up these subtext and really focus on how can the company be more proactive in their interventions. Because what I've seen in talking to my peers in the industry is that like oftentimes it's a little too late. When actions happen from users, when images and articles or any type of messaging that's a deviation from the community guidelines is issued, it's already too late for us, right? So I think how we address this in the tech industry is like, how can we close the gap of making sure that intervention is timely, right? Because it's not enough to just, from a technology perspective, we see it as an exception in our systems. We see it as an exception. Okay, let's resolve this. Do we need to ban the user? Do we need to keep the user and like figure out like how the user is linked to multiple accounts? Because platforms can see relationships between accounts. And users will build sub accounts and Cam talked about this. There's a lot of anonymity, right? But like everyone has one IP address. That's their ID. Yeah. And so looking at the relationships, closing the gap of intervention time, really, really targeting that is really what's going to get technology and platforms in the social media space really active, especially in addressing the GBV context. And then specifically around payments. So I'm going to address how we screen for payments and at a more general level, and I think this is applicable to a lot of payment companies globally. We screen for users that has a history of potentially participating in human trafficking. We work with regulatory agencies globally. We partner with them to think about ways in which we can adjust our monitoring, our algorithm, to not only think about sanctions, to not only think about like, hey, is this user doing payment activity that's beyond our guidelines? We partner with them to really get the insight around, is there illicit activity? And so from a payments perspective, every user is screened, obviously from a KYC perspective, but more importantly, I think the key issue here, and is something I want to be upfront with, is there is partnership behind the scenes with regulatory agencies to really address like how we define illicit activity, like trafficking, right? And identifying those core signals with our users from a payment perspective. If we see recurring payment activity that is coming from an IP address in Asia but is paying out to another part of Asia, but there's no story behind it, we can see those trends. We can flag those trends. And that is something that, from a payment perspective, we're constantly getting better at. So I will say, to conclude, from a payments industry perspective, we are always actively removing users that are promoting illicit activity, that are moving money to promote illicit activity, and it's always in the best interest not only for the company and the integrity of the financial system, but it's in the best interest to protect our users and the privacy of our users.
Thank you, Daniel. And I think we'll talk a bit more about algorithm and generative artificial intelligence, because I think one of the issues I think some of you will probably bring up is around sort of the transparency and civil society and others being really able to know what goes into those, right, into that thinking, and how do we make sure that it's not gendered or biased in other ways. But now to Eduardo. As a researcher in technology, innovation, and digitalization, thank you, of public policies, where do you see issues and gaps in technical and oversight teams at big tech companies and platforms, including in the context of product design and implementation, where they may be blind to issues of tech-facilitated GBV or may actually be making the problem worse?
Thank you so much. I feel that perhaps I can start from an example that sort of like illustrates some trends that we've seen in certain tech platforms, and from there I can pull some answers, I guess. So, of course, OGBV affects women and vulnerable populations in disproportionate ways, as we have seen so far. And the private sector has a duty to promote human rights within its private sector initiatives, profit-driven as they may be. There are thresholds that they should not necessarily cross, and there are concerns that they should adopt whenever they're designing different products. And I think that what we see a lot in global south context, like the one that I come from, which is Paraguay, is that there isn't necessarily a malice, but there's a complete detachment of the reality in which the platform or the digital service is being implemented that ends up facilitating situations of abuse, situations of gender-based violence, etc., etc. To give like just one very specific example, for example, one specific illustration, in the gig economy, for example, we are part of this network called the Fair Work Network that evaluates labor standards in the gig economy, the enjoyment of labor standards specifically. So what we've seen is that the big platforms, they change. Of course, some of them are better than others. But one platform in particular that is a ride-hailing platform, whenever they're doing the registration of the worker, for example, and there are more and more female workers in this ecosystem and different types of workers, they don't allow, whenever they're being registered, to declare a different sex rather than male and woman. So they limit the ability of the worker to express a different gender expression, and this in turn allows for clients to flag these workers as workers that are not matching the identity of that the platform is indicating from the worker, creating a situation of violence that ends up blocking the person's or the worker's account for several weeks, because then you also have the issue of appealing processes being moderated by computers most of the times and being too difficult to arrive at a human to illustrate the case in a more nuanced way. So also we've seen in the gig economy, particularly on transport apps, it's not necessarily an issue that is perhaps a design problem of the platform, but it's happening in the platform, and it's the issue that more and more we're seeing clients canceling women drivers under the argument that they are not fitted for driving, for example, and thus they don't want to go in a ride with a woman. So they wait until the woman to come at the post where it's going to pick up the person, and then they cancel there without explanation and also without any sort of penalty from the platform to the worker in particular. So I think those two examples show, in my opinion, not necessarily a evil by design approach of the platforms, but more a complete attachment between different groups that are working in a specific platform. We're talking about platforms with a lot of resources that could fit inclusive by design practices, privacy by design practices, and partner with different organizations that can help them better understand how to facilitate a more inclusive registration process for its workers that then would not allow for situations of discrimination on behalf of their clients to their workers or the other way around also. So I think that at the moment we could, in a way, at least argue that there is a level of discommunication between people who are designing the products and people who are doing the oversight of the community guidelines, the enforcement of the community guidelines, or even the design of the community guidelines that doesn't fit that other process. And another thing that I think this particular example shows is that we're seeing that, and I think what Daniel was saying was curious to me, like all platforms create information on how people utilize their services, right? All of these examples that I've seen are things that most likely Uber and other platforms can see happening within their platform and intervene. Let's say, okay, this is a male account that is only blocking female drivers on a constant basis in 100% of all cases. What's the story there? Should we perhaps flag something? Because this is not happening. This is not a possibility that is given to the worker who is only allowed to cancel X amount of trips before getting a penalty. Because what the platform wants is that the service to continue more and more. So I think, and not to finish on a more positive note, I guess, I think these examples could also show that it's easy to start thinking in inclusive by design practices that could merge the bridge or like bridge the gap between different groups working within these platforms and better tune down their policies, both at the design implementation stage, at the oversight of the community guidelines stage, and then also in terms of the monitoring of the behavior of different accounts and perhaps thinking in ways to intervene those situations by creating educational resources, by creating levels of, flagging that one can do as a worker or as a client to protect oneself and have a quick answer and a quick appeal process that is satisfactory for any person that is in a situation of vulnerability. So yeah, I will stop there.
Thank you, Eduardo. It's so interesting, right, that, we're thinking of explicit harassment and violence shutting women out of these spaces, but it sounds like there's sort of these implicit gender norms of discrimination that are doing the same thing in a way. And so, Kat, from your perch at the Web Foundation, which aims to advance the open web as a public good and a basic right, in a world where everyone has affordable, meaningful access to the web to improve their lives and where their rights are protected, that sounds wonderful. Is that reality though within reach, given the disturbing rise in tech-facilitated GBV, online abuse, harassment, discrimination, as we just heard, misinformation, malinformation, disinformation, a lot of it resulting in pushing women, activists and political aspirants in particular, away from the web and from public life? Give us some good news.
Thank you so much, and thanks to panelists for joining. It's really an honor to be on this discussion with you all, and thank you all for joining today too. It's great to see your faces. So Kat Townsend, and I'm from the World Wide Web Foundation. And so to your question of, do we have hope? I think I'm going to channel and paraphrase a quote from a US president, which is, our problems are made by us and they can be solved by us. The way that the web, the internet between those two are presented as, because it is a new technology and it's moving so quickly, it feels inaccessible or insurmountable. And I would offer that these are very similar problems that we've had throughout history, and every time we have a great new innovation, printing press, steamships, what are some other good ones? Radio. And so we can, anytime you have a new force, a new power, it can be used primarily targeting the most vulnerable. That there is also a great potential there to connect and bring empowerment and advancement to the people who have been most marginalized. That's what we try to do, and that's what we try to do through work with research and policy advocacy. And the founder of the organization actually invented HTML, he invented websites. So the reason the World Wide Web has its name is because of an invention 35 years ago last week by Tech University. And 35 years is very recent. So I think it's quite exciting. As scary as these issues seem, we are working in and living in a generation where we are shaping something that is quite transformative. And I think it can be generative for ourselves, not for AI, but for ourselves, and feel joyful that that there's a lot of potential here. So CERTIN or TBL, it goes by many different kinds of names, sent out a message last week on the anniversary reflecting on his invention. And why he invented the web was for everybody to have a space to convene, connect, and express themselves. So the web is the layer on top of the internet that actually physically connects everybody around the world and is sometimes disrupted. But it is the visual layer that we all use in a more simple way to see each other and to connect with each other. And he invented that because he said this shouldn't just be for academics or for military, it really should be for everyone. So how do we work to make that truly reality? The 2 points that he sort of flagged on is this monopolization from tech platforms to say you must use only our service in order to access online. And so people are really getting an experience of the web where it's not everybody's sharing their own expressions, it is through one company at a time. So you can have very rich, fulfilling experience of your day using maybe 3 apps that are owned by one company and not really realize that those are also interconnected. And then the other that he points to, which was never the design or the idea is that everyone sort of had an equal voice. Then the other that he points to is this cycling of data and of personal data. That the way that
That's true.
the way that the web works now is this idea that you have to collect data, you have to amass data, and you have to build profiles of people in order to create a service. And so, with apologies for the space, but Daniel, the way that you've presented the solutions in the company, which is just interesting, is that let's build profiles of the people who are using the product, which it makes sense to do, but there's also a question of how could we create these organizations where by design we're not collecting that data, or it's easier for people to choose pathways where they're not getting radicalized into violent misogyny. Can we construct a web and can we support organizations, whether civil society or government or private sector, where it is less easy to go down the pathway of violence. And I think that's what we are working on. And you can work on that through the web, and you can also work on it, as Tom has said, these are offline problems, have online parallels, offline solutions have online parallels. Get women leadership in, have more people who are diverse having that science and technology education so they can have those leadership roles. And by the way, have some art and philosophy and literature thrown in there, because if you only have tech in mind, then you will only have tech solutions. And we need these diverse leaders and solutions in there. And we need them in our company roles, we need them in civil society, and we need them in governments, because there's a lot of people in governments that rely on the private sector for the solutions because they don't have the knowledge themselves. And so we need a better pipeline, we need better leaders, and that will help a lot.
Thank you. This is a good segue to talking more about some of those solutions and interventions that seem to be working, particularly in bridging the gap between sort of the technical oversight teams and tech companies and what civil society and grassroots advocates are advocating for and what women and men are experiencing. So, Kim, if I could go back to you, given your experience working with men on masculinities and GBV, what do you think tech, especially male tech allies, should be more aware of, and what can they do about it?
I think a lot of points have been brought up by colleagues sitting here. But I think first of all, male tech allies or tech company need to realize that they have the responsibility on this issue beyond their products. Conversations about by design process has to think about the implication before they decide the product. The tech companies now are so powerful and they're so prominent because technology is so prominent in our life. Technological products are no longer just products. They are devices in our livelihood. So tech companies need to realize that whatever they decide, there will always be political, social, and cultural implications of the products. So that needs to be considered in their work, in their job. It's not only about making products and making money out of the product, but the responsibility that the tech companies have toward our society. Secondly, like what colleagues here were saying as well, is that it's very important that male alliance and tech companies specifically need to have conversation with women and girls, civil society organizations, and all those organizations that are working to end violence or to promote gender equality or promote diversity or end discrimination, because there needs to be a conversation how we can do this work together. And then the expertise can be shared. and the conversation can be had. Thirdly, in terms of bringing back to the topic of our conversation, which is specifically on the global south, and Kat mentioned quickly just now about expertise and experience of the global south in dealing with it, while a lot of the work comes from the global north. So it can feel so overwhelming in the global south context where there's not sufficient resources and capacity to deal with offline violence at the moment. And now we have to deal with online violence. And at the same time, there's not sufficient funding and expertise to deal with online violence, even in the developed country, the global north context. And for this global south context, dealing with so many things, this is even more overwhelming and it's more challenging. So the tech company needs to be working in this view that there needs to be support to the global south in dealing on this issue because of the lack of capacity, expertise, and also funding. And lastly, again, the connection between online and offline. They cannot be separated because we don't have enough sufficient evidence of what works to prevent online violence because it's still new and there's not enough documentation of what works and what do not work. However, we do know more about what works to prevent offline violence, and that work needs to be continued and to be pushed forward because those initiatives are aimed to address risk factors for offline violence, which I mentioned before, that are linked to online violence. So addressing offline risk factors for offline help addressing risk factors for online. So the work have to go hand in hand and they cannot be separated. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. It makes me think of some of the work we've been doing on creating gender lexicons. So, for example, with content moderation, how to really make sure that companies know the terms, which could be different in different languages and in different contexts, and sometimes they're coded words that really are actually very offensive terms. You know, how to really create that. You can create that without connecting to the women and girls in that community, right? So that's really interesting. And this idea of almost like a human rights assessment as you're creating the product. So Ali, some of this might be familiar to you, having spent a decade in the tech industry in Silicon Valley and now immersed in the experiences of women and girls facing online GBV in the Philippines and beyond. What have you seen as some promising intervention and where do you see gaps?
Yes, in my experience in the tech valley, I've seen that I've observed that women in tech is really important. Women, not only in tech, but women in rooms that, you know, decisions are made are important. But as important is that men already in these rooms making decisions are advocating for women's rights, right? Because it's some of these tech places, they're male dominated. Some of them men are already in higher places that make these decisions. And so if they advocate for women's rights and issues, then there is policy changes and it makes a better product, right? So these positive policies, processes, and beliefs, it all ultimately results in products that don't facilitate the exploitation of people, especially those that are already in desperate situations, right? And addressing gender-based violence in online spaces requires, like I said in my previous answers, is that the issue is very multifaceted because it's a whole ecosystem, and that's the same thing with solutions in tech. Just because we need to install safeguarding technologies, and you've mentioned generative AI. AI is great. AI because it makes a robust process or robust review, content moderation, that's great. But also at the same time, it's not just a technological issue, it's a human empathy issue. And I think Kat has mentioned that as well, as that we have to hire people as well who cares a lot about these stuff, right? It's not just tech. It's just not about revenue. It's not about ROI. It's also, how do I make things better? How do I make this space better? And in order to do that, we have to install human empathy. And by what I mean is installing, it's a technical word, but installing human or hiring human people, not human, that are trained enough, not only that they care enough, but they are trained enough to moderate and don't let anything pass, right? I think that's a very important, not just the technical aspect of it. So by combining automation with human empathy, it allows for creation of safer online environments for people, for kids, because sometimes, there's so many kids nowadays who don't go out and just use their iPads and play and use social media, use TikTok, for example, right? The 13-year-olds are in TikTok and they're so vulnerable to online gender-based violence, and that we have to have people in tech that are allies of making sure that we don't contribute more to what is already happening, and that helps mitigate the risk of more gender-based violence right now and in the future.
Thank you for that. And of course, there's the issue of the humans during the moderation themselves, then having the secondary trauma of having to view all of that, right? So it complicates things for sure. Eduardo, as a man in tech, how do you generate support for more male allies in the tech industry to stop this kind of online GBV and gender disinformation? And as you mentioned, how to really integrate gender intentional approaches and enforcement policies for both private and public sector in mitigating this phenomenon?
Thank you. And just to stretch a bit also what Ali was saying, I think that also in the current debate of generative AI, one thing that is very interesting is that all the data annotators are in very precarious working conditions that ends up also harming the moderation content as a whole. And it's something that is impacting disinformation, impacting the way automated sources are like flagging malicious content of all sorts. And it goes back also to this issue of what Ali was saying, poverty and how tech has different impacts in different regions based on socioeconomic status, based on race, class, and so many other gender, etc., etc. So I think that in terms of how to support more male allyship, and I think allyship is also a very important word to reflect, perhaps. But first, I would say that within TEDIC, which is kind of the work that we're doing in trying to evidence the disparities that are currently existing in terms of male versus female presence in the tech space, in the public sector, is we have this project called All Male Panel, which pretty much every time we see a panel in any space, we sort of like flag that in our website and we do a fun campaign about it, and we reflect about what it means to see a table dominated only by men, talking about an issue as if there were no women that know about the topic nationally and internationally. This campaign is focused in Paraguay, so we do a lot we follow a lot of like social media of like private sector companies, tech private sector companies, and government accounts, who both in equal ways and in equal percentages have more manuals than panels that are more representative. For them, sometimes what you have is like the strategy of like all men talking, and then the woman is the moderator, right? So that's sort of like what we've seen, because we see that the campaign is working. We see that people are worried not to be in that database, and it's an interesting way of forcing, in a way, a reflection. And I think that to frame it in a more positive way, I guess, it's not an issue of creating these databases to make some sort of shaming to these people who are doing work and that are not necessarily very trained or human empathetic enough to see those differences, because you really do need to have a trained eye, fortunately still in this century, to understand those kind of disparities and what it means. What we want to do with this is with very visual campaigns, evidence the situation and evidence that it is a problem, and with that evidence, you hopefully get more allies that are then trained in how to identify those issues, how to flag whenever there is a disparity situation within their own companies or within the public sector as a whole. And I think that we're in the process also of, to the point of the online versus the online. So far, this campaign has only been conducted online. The idea is for this year to go out on the streets, do graffitis, talking about the all main panels and what it means and what are the different implications. And going to the issue of the of my reflection on the allyship, I think that it's very important that we get more and more male allies that are helping in evidence in these situations and the need for action internally in companies, internally also in government, and in the space wherever they are. But I think that that has to be done hand in hand with women and vulnerable communities, because I think that allyship can be also very easily confused with championship. And we've had a lot of discussions in this in marches in Latin America, like the 8th of March march, or the 25th November day, that is the day of fighting towards all forms of violence towards women, where, of course, men are very welcome to join the marches, men are very welcome to support the event, but they are not to be in the front line of the march, or they are not to be those having the microphone in those days. So they are there to support, to facilitate, to amplify those messages, but not take appropriation of them necessarily. So I think that this would apply very perfectly to this scenario, where we need those male allies in tech space, because they are the ones dominating right now the space. You go to the technical division of any tech company, and it's mostly men most of the time. So we need those allies there, but we need those allies there to also flag the need of more parity within their teams, to flag perhaps, or to be conscious about how a certain product that is only forcing one person to register as sex of women might bring, as men or women, might bring all sorts of problems in different communities, and especially in countries, for example, where there are no sex change laws. And sex name, you know, when you change your name, I don't know how to say it in English, like in Paraguay, for example, we're not allowed to change our names or to change our gender, unfortunately. So trans women right now are forced to hold the legal identity with their dead name. I think that there is a big role here that platforms can take in creating more amicable and diverse spaces, as the whole world is. And the other thing is, with the female allyship, this thing that you were talking about, like how promote more healthy masculinities and ideas and messages. There are many organizations that are working in these issues, like Men Stop Rape, for example, is an interesting example that we could potentially start thinking in how to bring some of those examples of promoting more healthy masculinities that are more sensible to different issues that are not necessarily male, quote unquote, to spear more allies in tech that can help us fight this issue.
Thank you, Eduardo. Daniel, I think you're a male ally in tech. I think we can call you that. You're here. Tell us more about what you've seen as effective interventions in bridging those gaps that we're talking about between the technical oversight teams in tech companies and platforms, in civil society, grassroots advocates, and women working on gender-based violence online. And then, if you could round it up with how you balance profit, technological innovation, and social responsibility as a tech company.
So I will say, before I go in, I'm proud to work at a company that has 50% of women in our executive committee. Our board of directors is roughly 33% women. So, you know, in terms of the representation, that is something we think about even as a company. Like, the diversity of thought is so important as we get to decision making. So I wouldn't want to start by saying that I'm proud to work at a company that really cares about diversity. So in terms of like effective interventions, I will just briefly talk about a recent example, I think a year or two ago, at a previous workplace where it was really the ERG at the tech company that raised this issue about how we onboard customers who actually want to use their dead name. Oh, sorry. ERG is an employee resource group. So at every company, typically, like there's like affinity networks, right? Like, for example, you can have, like, I was part of the parents network. I was at my previous workplace at a bank. I was part of the Asian Professionals Network, the Hispanic Latino Network, the LGBTQ network. Right, these are the ERGs, or employee resource groups. So, on the topic of dead name, right, when you're thinking about it from a product perspective, right, you have to think about the end-to-end value chain. Right? How do you onboard a customer with all these different providers in the value chain to be able to provide the services that your platform ultimately needs to provide, right? And so it was actually the ERG, right, these resource groups, these affinity networks, specifically the LGBTQ network, that brought this issue up. And I think, when we talk about the human empathy that my colleagues here talked about, that's really an effective intervention, because outside of profits, you have people who have come together with some common ground, who are actually advocates of the users in some degree, shape, or form, right? So we looked at, there's a full taxonomy of gendered lexicons, right? When you think about it from a product perspective, these companies have to figure out scale, right? But again, contextualize the value chain, right? It's not enough for just let's say, a social media platform to actually affect the lexicon, whatnot. You have other dependent supply chain providers, like the banking policy associated with their partner, their partnerships agreement with other providers. If we're talking about it from a payments perspective, like buy now, pay later, or direct payments, there's this whole ecosystem of like change that needs to happen in order to just affect one change. So the story I'm bringing up is just, I'll summarize it real quick. We had a number of rejected customers that wanted to use their dead name. And we looked at the feasibility. We did a feasibility study. Obviously, we had to look at the percent of customers that are wanting to use this. The ERG was very, very pivotal in advocacy. Like, I kid you not, I think, it's great that in companies, employee resource groups have executive sponsors, right? And they do that because, to the earlier point of my colleagues, it shifts away from championship to allyship, right? So this issue came up, and obviously from a business perspective, we have to think about the ecosystem, but we also have to think about how we can scale the issue, right? Because we're talking millions of users, right? Fortunately, the solution we came up with was, let's have a manual review. Let's test it out. If the volumes of the users increase, right, and we're able to manage it without hiring more people, without changing our infrastructure, let's have that one-off solution. And so we did, right? And so users can actually go in, there's agreed MOUs across our providers to be able to say, hey, this user has provided the necessary documentation. I mean, we had to train our operations teams to be very sensitive, right? To ask someone like their dead name is very sensitive. And so from a technology perspective, like, how you balance all of this is really around, like, leveraging the advocacy of ERGs, or employee resource groups, but also thinking about like how you can make the product more broad in the context of ensuring that the agreements you have in the value chains are not disruptive. Because at the end of the day, right, like, product doesn't look at these non-product considerations. And it's unfortunate. Should it happen more? Absolutely. But when you're thinking about it from a company perspective, you're looking at boundaries within local jurisdictions. So to the point of my colleagues earlier, some of the laws may not pertain to that. But if you want to be an inclusive platform, like how do you codify those different local jurisdictions? How do you balance, maintaining and supporting an ad hoc process, making it more scalable, and albeit the fact that this non-product consideration may not be as profitable, like how do you prioritize that, right? And so balancing this is a tough act, but as I mentioned before, one thing that worked for us in my previous roles is the advocacy of internal employee groups, right? It's the LGBTQ network that really drove the necessity of the solution. And I'm sure there are other alliances within tech companies, and it's growing. At my company, we have a women's networking group, so we do talk about, Women's History Month. How do we think about mentoring and coaching, right? But again, in terms of like being an ally, affecting change at the tech level is very multifaceted, but it's possible. So,
Thank you, Daniel. It's interesting, and I'm sure Kat will have more responses. But one of the projects we worked on last year was talking to many civil society organizations who work around these issues, and overwhelmingly they said what they needed was legislation and legally related approaches, as well as transparency to really deal with some of those issues, and really requiring these kind of multi-stakeholder coalitions and strategies, right, that involve the companies, but also governments and civil society and media and judicial bodies. That seems to be a really promising approach. India, for example, has been part of supporting the work of the Global Partnership for Action on Gender-Based Online Harassment and Abuse, which is a multi-government, multi-stakeholder platform with over a dozen governments now, as well as Tech for Democracy initiatives. And there are others. And, it'd be great, Kat, specifically, if you could talk, in addition to whatever other reactions you have, what are some global efforts that we should all be watching out for that could really give us some actionable strategies on how to address and mitigate online gender-based violence, and how to get more allies on board?
So Celia, I think you said it really well, that it is how you get those multifaceted approach. How are you getting legal, and how do you have civil society groups? And I think one of the things that we're really encouraged by is the proliferation of coalitions and coalitions of civil society working together across different geographies, sharing information, sharing strategies. We're also seeing funders, the traditional funders, are more interested in supporting coalitions, which is great because, as we know, organizations in the global majority can do a lot with a smaller amount of money. They deserve more, but it's often the case that the funds just go to larger organizations, and so being able to have coalitions is a way of getting more input, more resources, and really distributing these strategies and power. And I think it's those kinds of organizations that maybe could come into the conversations with companies like the ones that Daniel runs, because for me it was such an interesting response to how is civil society supporting the work that you're doing on TFGBV, and the answer was, we have internal processes and internal teammates. And it's great that Pioneer has more than 50% of the executives are women, or 50% are. A lot of companies don't have that. And so how do we demonstrate paradigms and models of tech companies that are participatory, that are transparent, as you said, that are listening to and responsive to and accountable to civil society organizations? Because I think it is a very traditional model and we've seen it's a very traditional model to rely on minoritized groups within your company to affect change from within and advocate and hope that somebody will listen to them. That is not a scalable strategy. And so it's one of the reasons that we have regulation and we have legislation and we require transparency from companies. Because it's not just unfortunate that product designers don't listen to others. It's actively causing harm to be so siloed. So we really do advocate for greater transparency and for those coalitions of civil society organizations working with feedback loops, with sort of accountable and public processes. How are you asking for their input? What input did they give? That can't be behind closed doors either. How did you respond? How quickly did you respond? What's the demonstrated change on your platform? How can we measurably assess whether the change on your platform actually led to a change in experiences? Because that is a huge barrier that we have, is we'll get responses from platforms and from governments, it's any that have a large power and a large user base, and we'll say, well, it looks very different. But we don't actually have the data from them to say, here's how many people are saying they've been harassed, here's what they're reporting. All of that is still very much kept behind closed doors. So a lot of the data and transparency work is very necessary and needed. So I think the civil society coalitions are useful, and then again, multifaceted approach. What is the UN doing? So we have the UN Global Digital Compact. Many of you may be involved in that process. There is a group of other coalitions working on feminist and gendered principles for the GDC, which you all are welcome to join, and getting governments to sign on to that. There is the GEF out of UN Women, Generation Equality Forum that was announced 3 years ago. That is also amassing work around the world to try to close barriers on access and on TFGBV. There's also the global partnership that you mentioned. So I do think that none of this will happen, and there are tech coalitions of tech companies that are trying to work together with each other on how can they address these problems. So I think that we do have this multifaceted approach. We can sort of simplify it into top-down and grassroots, but that's needed, and it's needed from many different sides. What I will offer, what we've seen in this past year, last year we tried to get any traction on TFGBV, and it was really hard to do. There's not even a conference where we can convene. We're always sort of at the sides of events. That's starting to shift. We're starting to have spaces that are specifically dedicated to this issue. And as that proliferates, I think we really need to speak with one voice, not just about the harms online, but what the impact and the growth and support that women can have when they have an equal space online.
Yeah.
So we need to talk about leadership and the education and the economic growth that is untapped or under-realized. Because if we only talk about it in a negative sense, then that's what we're seen as, and that's also the enabling environment that we share with younger women and with men as well, as the point of this panel, is we want the online space to be seen as a place where women are really thriving, and so we need to tell that story and have that be the vision of our work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This very much reflects what we always say, that if the digital ecosystem is not safe for women's self-expression, where they can express their views and perspectives, it's just not safe for democracy, right? So we really do see it as a systemic issue. I wanted to just open the floor for a few minutes if you have reactions to each other or any other sort of closing remarks you wanted to offer. Sure, and of course, if any of you have any questions you'd like to pose, let me know and I'll pass the mic to you. And as you're thinking of questions, one second.
Thank you. My name is Anastasia Sagovich. Thank you to all the panelists and the moderator for a fantastic panel. A follow-up question around something that was mentioned midway through the panel about looking, it seemed to me like network analysis of behavior of users and identifying potentially suspect activities and linking that to the financial system. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit about the digital financial system in the sense that there is this new dawn of, let's say, perhaps digital payments that are beyond physical money, so digital currencies. And I was wondering if you can speak to perhaps inroads being made in that space where by design some of the systems are anonymous, and that's a feature, not a bug. And we do know that we have network science and data science and machine learning, et cetera, that can flag certain systems. But I wonder, to your point about having one IP address when there are different layers that are by design made to not be so public. I was wondering what your thoughts are around taking these techniques or maybe exploring new techniques to safeguard that space. Thank you so much again to everyone, and really enjoyed learning from all of you. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. I think it's very timely. My intention with the statement was really to clarify that, like, the payment platforms are part of the ecosystem that moves money globally, right? And so what I mean by protecting the financial integrity, it's making sure the money is good money. It doesn't fund illicit activity. So in terms of network analysis and kind of what we're looking at, just broadly speaking here, especially in the fintech space, the network analysis is really aimed at identifying like relationships that would that is very implicit. So like if, for example, we have this framework of like tenant owner, right? So like if, for example, there are 1,000 accounts, right? And the creation of those accounts were timed or created within like 1 second of each other, as an example. Or the movement of money is the same amount across all 1,000 accounts and moved within 1 day. That could tell us a couple things. It could note fraud. But what's going to be helpful for us, and this really extends beyond like the profiling of these users, is really around scraping and supportability of these accounts. So look, a lot of users enter the platform day in, day out, right? I talk about the importance of scale, and so it's really difficult to manually review every account of the 1,000 accounts set up. But I think what's important to note is how network analysis is utilized is really around scraping, so looking at signals, but trying to understand the trends and the risk typologies that tell us as a platform whether or not the user is bad, right? That judgment is, I don't want to say highly subjective, but it's not foolproof, and it's a work in progress. And we're going to see this both from a human and from a AI perspective. But I think it's going to be very important, even just forward looking, that we work with civil society coalitions. We think about legislations that allow platforms to be sort of, inclusive by design, but like think through the data points they're collecting and like how we can leverage, or not leverage, but like clearly articulate the purpose and usage of those data points. So hopefully that answers your question.
Any other questions from the audience? Wonderful. Any last comments any of you want to make? All of you? Any of you?
I'm just going to, excuse me, plus up TEDx campaigns. If you haven't seen their visual campaigns, they are fantastic. And so I'm very excited that you all are also like taking it to the streets and going out in the community, because I think you all do really just like transformative campaigning that many people beyond Paraguay and South America can help.
Hopefully it will work that way. We can do a lot of graffitis also to reflect on facial recognition technologies and the impacts of those technologies in the right to circulate freely on the streets, etc., etc., etc. Perhaps I think that more than a reflection, I think that also a bit of this panel was, or the purpose of this panel was to put different processes that are currently tackling this issue from a coalition building approach. So Gad and I are part of the Women's Rights Online Coalition, which is hosted within the Web Foundation, but has numerous partners, civil society partners from the global south and across the world. And we're working on different issues and from different perspectives to understand what is online gender-based violence from a better data point of view, meaning generating data around the subject in a more unified way. Also, what it means or what is perpetrators, what are they, where are they, how can we better understand them, and then also how can we regulate this situation, online gender-based violence, from a policies and intervention point of view, and also how can we better develop evaluation frameworks that can serve tech companies to test how their systems are impacting. And those are all processes that are ongoing at the moment, that are participatory as well, because we use this methodology called TPDL, whereby doing this research, but also workshops with different groups of people from across the globe, we get data and we generate a conversation to answer these questions that we have. So if anyone is interested in that, please feel free to reach me, and I can include you in those threads and see how you can participate from here until the end of April, where we're going to finish this process. There's a question.
Thank you for this panel. I'm coming from Turkey. I'm a representative of a foundation called Women and Democracy, and we have been organizing biannual summits, international summits. The last summit was about gender norms. We were trying to tackle the gender norms inherent in all global patriarchy. And this year, in November, we are trying to organize a summit focusing on artificial intelligence and women. And we have been doing some researches, especially in our country, when online problems are very much similar with offline problems. That's why this panel is very much important, so much important for us. And I would like to be a part of any companionship, partnership, and alliance with any and every of your organizations. And thank you for this opportunity. Thank you so much. And if there are no more questions, and sadly we're also out of time, I wanted to thank all of you for coming out here and sharing these really important observations. Clearly there's a lot of work to be done, and clearly if we don't work together, it's not going to happen effectively, and it's not going to actually mitigate the problem. So thank you for coming together. Not all of us agree on everything, but that's exactly what we need, right? We need those points of contestation to make us all better. Thank you so much, and thank you for all of you.